Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Charles Martin, the editor of Inner Light Books. Charles, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. I wonder if we could start by you telling us what you see as the mission or purpose of Inner Light Books.
Well, thank you for interviewing me, Marcelle. In preparing for this interview, I went through some of my records and I found in May of 2004, I wrote a publisher's statement of purpose, and I think I'll read this as a starting point. This is called Shoulders of Love. The longer I live and the more I see of the struggles of souls towards the heights above, the stronger the thought comes back to me that the universe rests on the shoulders of love. A love so limitless, deep and broad, that men have renamed it and called it God. This was by Oliver Shaw Fell, who lived from 1833 to 1904. Nearing the end of his life, Oliver Shaw Fell wrote this poem for his associates at the Universal Peace Union. Fell was born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania on 10/3 month, 1833, into the Religious Society of Friends, and died on 31st, 12th month, 1904 in Chester, Pennsylvania. Fell spent his life in faithful service to the causes of anti-slavery, temperance, and peace. Fell worked as a teacher for 35 years, and then as the business manager of the Universal Peace Union. Oliver Shaw Fell's life was in many ways similar to those of other 19th century liberal, quote, Hicksite Quakers. For over 350 years, the Religious Society of Friends has been made up of individuals such as Oliver Shaw Fell. Inner Light Books was formed to help tell their stories. In publishing books by and about Quakers and books that examine Quaker values, it is the hope of the publisher to expand the knowledge of and appreciation for the faith and practice of the Religious Society of Friends. The first publication of Inner Light Books is scheduled for release this coming winter. It is the intention of the publisher to offer all texts online as well as in book form. The text published will be from the original unpublished manuscripts as well as out-of-print books. The publishing program will concentrate on 17th, 18th, and 19th century text. 20th century and contemporary text will be published when the subject matter merits it. The following excerpt is from a 17th century out-of-print text that should be published this coming year. And this is from the Meditations and Experiences by William Shewan, and this is meditation number 4. The precious light which shineth in the heart is the everlasting day of God, in which he walks and in which he works. Blessed are those that walk with him and work with him. They can tell of his mighty acts and speak of his wondrous works. Those that walk in this light and are become children of this day are witnesses of the true everlasting worship, which is in the spirit and the truth. Such are come to the substance and end of all legal administrations and temple worship, which consisted in much daily killing and daily offerings of bullocks, rams, lambs, and etc. Now those that are come to worship in spirit witness a daily dying and a daily offering till death is known. Such know that it is easier to kill a bullock or a ram outwardly than to kill or mortify the beastly nature within. And it is a greater work to witness the will wholly resigned up into the will of the Lord, and the thoughts and imaginations brought down into the disobedience of the cross, into the obedience of the cross, than to perform the outward part of worship, commanded in the laws. I testify to all that those who know not the beastly nature slain and offered up in themselves, and their thoughts and wills subjected, are not come to the end of the law, nor from under it, nor to the one everlasting offering, Christ Jesus. Now, my views have changed somewhat since I wrote this almost 17 years ago. For one thing, I would say that I'm interested in others than just liberal Hicksite Quakers, 19th century Quakers. And I found in my experience that in all the variations of our Quaker faith, that there were individuals like Oliver Shaw Fell who dedicated their life to doing good works. And the story of the Religious Society of Friends is so compelling to me, and the faith and practice is so compelling, that I felt a calling to proclaim it in the old sense of publishing. Publishing is to proclaim. Now, 17 years later, I found that I've published more books by contemporary friends on contemporary subjects than I have the older friends, even though I've done 2 books about John Woolman, 3 books about Elias Hicks, a book about James Naylor, 1 book about the early Quakers in the Kingdom of God. I've done a book on William Penn and the settlement of Pennsylvania, and I've done a book on William Penn's writing on primitive Christianity revived. So I've covered many of the things that I said I was going to set out to do, with the exception I don't have all the lines online in text form, even though there are excerpts from each book. And there are a couple that are online, but I've also put it out in ebook form, which is different than a print form, but are used in different ways. So that was my original purpose, and it hasn't changed all that much. It's been quite a journey. I do think that actually the other day I had quite an experience. The San Francisco Friends meeting decided to have a 2nd-hour program on eldering, and the facilitators of the program started us off by doing 3 exercises. The first, they split up the group, which was about 20 people, into individual rooms on Zoom, and told the people to sit there and to seek God. And a few minutes later, they called us back and paired us off. So 2 of us would go into a room. One was to be holding in light or in prayer the other person who was seeking God. And then after a few minutes, he brought us back together, and the whole room was put together, and 3 or 4 people, or maybe 5, were assigned to sit and hold the meeting, while the others in the meeting sat there and looked for God, to look to connect to God. And every one of the participants, and when we started talking afterwards, admitted that it was one of the most profound experiences that they'd had, that it was so deep, it was so gathered, that they really felt that they were in a gathered meeting. And it showed to me that really the message, our Quaker message, is really quite simple. Seek first the kingdom of God. And Jesus did say, my kingdom is not of this world. And I look at it as that the kingdom of God is heaven, and that is where God dwells. And it is capable, we are all capable, each and every one of us as a human being is capable of entering into that place where God dwells, into God's presence. And when we do that, we are instructed in all things. And this is something that I'm afraid many contemporary friends have forgotten. I think that in some ways, contemporary friends have been more caught up in the good works without first trying to access that foundation, which will lead them in the correct way to do those works. And so that's one reason, excuse me, that I continue to publish, and that I publish with mainly the writings of contemporary friends who I consider ministers of the written word, though many of them are also ministers in the traditional sense of being vocal ministers, but every one of them has a real adeptness at taking these thoughts about our faith and our practice and putting them into words that are comprehensible to the contemporary person.
Wonderful, thank you. So you started Inner Light Books in 2004, 17 years ago. Could you tell us how you experienced your leading to create Inner Light Books? As I understand it, you were engaged in a profession rather different from being the publisher of books for most of your career.
That's correct. In 1996, I started attending meeting as a 45-year-old man. My paternal grandmother was a friend, and her family, all the way back to the beginning of Quakerdom, were friends. And my father was not a friend. It ended with my grandmother. So I grew up without a faith community, without being in a faith community. But in 1991, my mother-in-law died, and my wife and I went to my mother-in-law's church to arrange for a memorial service. And I found myself deeply touched by the pastor's sermon when she read from Paul's letter to the Corinthians on love. And I realized that something was lacking in my life. Through happenstance, a few years later, I went to the San Francisco Friends meeting and had that sensation that many friends say that when they sat down, they felt they'd come home. For me, meeting for worship was a very sort of mysterious thing. I didn't know exactly what was happening, though something was happening to me, and I would have these sensations. I would witness things that I just couldn't explain. And so I joined the adult education discussion group, which had a practice, or still has a practice, of meeting weekly and reading from Quaker texts and then having a discussion about what's being read, and also answering questions for people who are unfamiliar with the ways of Friends. And it was in that group, we were reading from Jessamine West's anthology. I'm drawing a blank on the name, of Quaker writings. And I noticed that oftentimes I was just really, really impressed by what I'd read. I remember reading one of Mary Pennington's thing and thought, boy, this woman really understands what's going on. And we would get to the end of the essay or the piece of writing, and it would say, this is from an excerpt from a book that's out of print. This is from something that is out of print. And I thought, well, maybe these books should be brought into print. And then somebody exposed me to the Quaker Heritage Press books. One was by a guy named Diamond, who wrote about his experience as a sailor who became a pacifist. And another one was Job Scott's Salvations by Christ. And I saw what the Koonings were doing at Quaker Heritage Press as a model of what could be done. And because there were so many books that were out of print, that I felt there was probably room for another publisher. I did have a couple of problems, though, that for one thing, I do nothing about publishing. I didn't have any skills as an editor or in graphic design. I was still old-fashioned enough that when I wrote correspondence for work, I went through a secretary who then edited and gave it to me to sign. And so I decided I had to get educated. And there was the University of California had an extension course that they offered in publishing, because there were at one time a lot of publishers in San Francisco, and it was the type of thing to help people get skills to get a promotion in the publishing business. And there was a sequence of, I think it was 5 or 6 courses that you took. And I took them, and I wasn't really very good at many of them, to be honest, but I took them, I gutted it out. And in the last class that I took, we were assigned to have a informational interview with a local publisher. And so I looked around and I saw that there was a man who had a publishing business that was very close to my office. And I arranged to have an interview with him. And it, excuse me, I need to have a little drink here. And it turned out that he was what's called a letterpress printer. He still printed using lead letters in the old, it was mechanical press, but still a 2-color press. Actually, it was pretty sophisticated. And he had decided to print a lectern Bible. Part of it being that great printers throughout history are compared by looking at their Bibles that they printed. It's one way for, it's one standard text that so many, well, at least Western European, I guess, printers that they would use. And he wanted to, he was a great printer, and I think he wanted to leave a legacy that would be able to compare him to earlier great printers. And I was so taken by that project that when I returned home, I told my wife, you know, if I really want to learn the publishing business, I should go to work for somebody like Andrew. And she said, well, you know, why don't you do it? And I said, well, for one thing, I'd take a big cut in pay, and, you know, and he didn't offer me a job. And so I sat down and I wrote him a letter offering to go to work for him. And I ended up doing that. And I was basically his office manager and his Bible salesman. And I thought when I took that job that I would be there for 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years at the most, and I would know enough to go out and start a publishing business and be able to support myself publishing Quaker text. Well, that didn't happen. I ended up working for Andrew for almost 12 years. And it took me, it wasn't until 2000, actually in 2004, I wrote that statement of purpose, but I actually didn't get my first book into print until 2008, the end of 2008, the beginning of 2009, for various reasons. And excuse me one moment. And the printing business totally changed just as I started this venture. The old way of printing books, of going to a printer and getting 1,000 copies printed up and, you know, selling them and taking them to wholesalers and book dealers and trying to sell them, it all changed almost overnight with the advent of desktop publishing. And then some years later, Amazon and ebooks. The devices we're using now weren't there. And we had desktop computers, but it was pretty unsophisticated. So it all changed overnight, but the impetus of it was that being part of that discussion group and getting what I now call a leading calling. I didn't really understand it at the time, but I ended up being faithful in carrying out that calling.
Charles, as I've heard the story before, it involves something about an illness you had and a point at which you felt like you were pushed to make a decision that you were resisting. Is my memory
right? Well, one of the things that happened was in 2010, I was diagnosed with bladder cancer, and I underwent a 8.5-hour operation and had my bladder removed and a lot of my internal things rearranged, and I almost died in the recovery room. And while I was, when the nurse told me that my blood pressure was dropping precipitously and that they were going to do whatever they could to get it back up, I understood that they might not, and that might be it. So I did a review of my life and understood, one of the things that I understood was that I had not applied myself as much as I should to the publishing venture, that I put in all this work preparing for it, and it might be gone before I actually accomplished much. Now, I had gotten a couple of books out, and I told God that if my life was spared, that I would do whatever God wanted me to do, and I really meant it this time. And I did. After I recovered, I ended up leaving working for Andrew, and I've dedicated myself full time to publishing since then. And I could, because I was 62 years old and I was able to start at that time, start Social Security early. So I did have enough money coming in to cover my living expenses. And my wife wasn't worried about me bringing a paycheck home anymore. I mean, we had bought a house at such a time that it was paid off, and we were able to live on a couple of Social Security checks in our savings.
So you changed your life. You took the step to be faithful to a call that you had been preparing for, but sort of resisting for a while. And what happened after you sort of gave yourself over to God and dedicated yourself to the work that you felt you were called to?
Well, actually, it was before I had the bladder surgery, before I had that illness. I had the good fortune of meeting Paul Buckley. And Paul Buckley is an excellent writer and a very deep thinker and a true minister of God. And we connected, and I had published his journal of Elias Hicks, which showed me the format. We didn't go into that. Actually, let me backtrack just a little bit. When the excerpt that I read from William Shewan, that was the first book that I published. And like I had said earlier, I was trying to follow the format that the Koonings had established with Quaker Heritage Press and finding out of print books, transcribing them, getting them into readable form. But following Leisha Kooning's advice, I didn't do any editorial comment. She really believed on sort of a light hand that people can understand the words as they were written. And I got the book out and got it in print, and I was so happy. And I decided, because Amazon was in business by then, to go and see it up on the screen. And when I did, there was another version of the same book. There was a photo facsimile. And I saw that and I thought, oh no, how is anybody going to be able to distinguish my book from this other book? And it become a matter of price, blah, blah. And so I was devastated. I thought, well, there's that plan's out the window. There's really no sense for me to spend all that time getting a book to look nice when somebody could take a photo of it and put it up for sale. And I didn't really want to do that. I didn't want to just start publishing facsimiles, even though that was possible. But it was obvious there was other people doing that, and they probably had the ways and means to do it better than I did. But I had met Paul at a QUIP, that's a Quakers United in Publications conference one year, and had a discussion with him. And at that time, he had just finished his 21st Century Pen. It was published by Earlham School of Religion and through their publishing program. And we had a discussion at lunch about what he was working on. And he had told me that he was really interested in Elias Hicks. And Hicks was one of the people that I was really interested in. And we got into a big discussion. And I thought Hicks's sermon should be published. And Paul said, no, they're the last thing you should publish. And so we got into a big go around an argument. But then a year or two later, I got a letter from him. And he said, would you be interested in publishing my edition of the journal? And so we talked, and I ended up doing it. And so that got me working with Paul, and that relationship had been established before I really got sick. But it also gave me a credibility and other. Actually, I think I'd done a couple of others. I'd have to look at the actual dates. I'd had 3 or 4 books that had gotten out before I'd gotten sick. But after that, the focus really changed to publishing books by contemporary friends on various matters.
And Charles, I believe this happened at the same time that other publishers of books by contemporary Quakers were stopping what they were doing. That they were, Pendle Hill Publications began to stop publishing books. Quaker Books published fewer books, and so and others. And so at the same time that other publishers were publishing avenues were no longer available to contemporary Quaker authors, you began to step up to follow this leading and made publication available to many Quaker authors contemporary authors who otherwise wouldn't have been able to publish their books in this time.
Well, yes, that's what happened. And it wasn't by design. And that's one of the things about my story is most of the things where people might say, oh, I really accomplished a lot, it sort of fell into my lap. As you say, when I first went into pursuing this business, there was major publishing programs at Quaker Books of FGC, Britain Yearly Meeting, Pendle Hill, FUM had a big publishing program. There was the Barclay Press for the Evangelical Friends. There were still, William Sessions was still publishing, the Sessions of York was still going on. And there were some other independent publishers, but most of that started drying up right away. And I don't know, that would be a discussion for another time and with other people who really were there and knew what happened. But the impetus for the institutionalized publishing arms of the Quaker world started drying up. Now, there has been a bit of a revival in recent years, which is good, but it really looked like it was over. And that was troubling. But because I was there and I was actually putting out a good product, people could look and see that the books that I did were well made and well edited. And that I started getting, people would contact me about publishing networks.
So,
and it's been one of the real blessings of my life, to be honest.
and your faithfulness has been a blessing to the Quaker community, that you made publication available to many contemporary Quaker authors who wouldn't have found it otherwise. So you started out by planning to publish or reprint books that were out of print from Quakers of other centuries, and you have ended up publishing some of those, but many more books by contemporary Quaker authors. And can you say something a little bit about how your sense of purpose or mission evolved over time as you began to work with contemporary Quaker authors?
Well, what I did come to more fully understand as it went along was that there is a true ministry of writing, and that it's a ministry that I think has been underappreciated by the institution of the Religious Society of Friends. And it goes against our history. That's one of the things that's been sort of troubling to me, is that, Friends look back, publishing was always just as important as vocal ministry. And when they had the Valiant 60 going out, they didn't go out, whatever town they showed up in, pamphlets would arrive germane to whatever discussions they were going to be having. It was a tremendous culture. And so it was obvious that the ministry of writing was so important. And that was true all the way up until the middle of the late 20th century. Those publishing arms stayed in one form or another for all those years. And then the world changed so much, in the last 50 years that there seemed to be an inclination to do away with that. So I would say that I didn't really fully understand the ministry of writing when I started off in this project. I really was sort of just one of those old romantic, loved the old folks back in the 17th century Quakers, and liked to hear those stories and wanted to reproduce them, and I realized that that mission never went away, and God needs us today in the 21st century just as much as he needed Margaret Fell and George Fox and all of those other people in the 17th century and all of the abolitionists in the 18th century and 19th century. The work is still there for us to do. And the role that I see Interlight Books and other venues like mine is that we're here to help educate and to train the ministers. One of the problems that I see in the modern Quaker world is that we've lost the understanding that ministers are developed, elders are developed, gifts have to be developed. Some people just spring out of nowhere, but true ministry is a discipline, and it needs to be supported. And we don't support our ministers very well. And our ministers would have more support if we valued the institution of eldering, because that's what the elders are supposed to do. They support the ministers and they guide the spiritual nurturing of the meeting. And we've done away with that, at least in the liberal unprogrammed part of the Quaker world that I live in. And I'm hoping that in some ways, this publication program will encourage people to have study groups, will encourage people to form faithfulness groups like the one that you wrote about in your book, encourage people to have support committees and anchor committees and spiritual formation groups, to form these little covenant communities that have been going on for a number of years with friends. I think that's a very, very important part of the Quaker world. And the more we do that, the more ministers will get amongst us. And the people who are doing the social action work will have a grounding and they won't be able to get that support that they need, because it's hard work and it's necessary work, and it really needs a community to support it, and the community needs to know what it's doing. You know, we have a special place in the world, and I know people don't like this talk about being special, or you know, thinking that we're exclusive or any of that stuff, but there's a need, and there's a niche, and there's a place for the Quakers in this world, and we should do our job right. We should do our job well.
Thank you. So you've named several different ways that Quakers recognize and support those with ministries and meetings. And as you said, you've published some of the books you've published have talked about that, including my little book about faithfulness groups. How have you yourself been supported in your ministry of publishing?
Well, I've been supported in different ways over the years, and to be honest, I didn't often seek out support. You know, I'm afraid that I was brainwashed, like so many Americans, and this rugged individualist, you know, I just go out and do it myself type of thing. And I'm still working on that. You know, I'm still trying to wean myself from that idea that, you know, I can do it. I can be the sheriff who comes into town and cleans up the town, you know. But over the years, for one thing, that Thursday night group that I belonged to for so many years was always the support. You know, there were several people in that group that were very, very supportive of my work and encouraging, and I could talk to when I was wrestling with problems, oftentimes not related to the publishing work, but you know, other problems come from outside of that, and it interferes with doing the work that's been assigned us. In later years, I got a formal support committee, which is very helpful, that meets, when we meet every month, but we rotate between 4 individuals. So I really only get concentrated on 3 or 4 times a year, but they're always there in case something comes up that I need to talk about right away. And in our check-ins, I always have to check in and let them know where I'm at. I was formally released by the San Francisco Friends meeting from responsibilities to the meeting to concentrate on publishing a couple of years ago, and that's an acknowledgement. The Quakers United in Publications group was always a way of support, because as the title implies, it was a networking way to network with other people who were doing this type of work. And I made a number of really good friends and spiritual friends and friends through that organization over the years. And they've supported me too.
So what kinds of support and nurture do you think are needed in order for you to be fully faithful?
Well, I think the main thing is just having people check in with me every once in a while and making sure that I'm remaining faithful. I'm not slacking off. Last year, one of my real anchors, a man named Stephen Matchett, died suddenly. And Stephen was probably the one person who I would check in the most with. You know, we'd been friends for many years, and I had accompanied him when he did some traveling in the ministry, and I was on his support committee. He was on my support committee. So that was a very special relationship, and I do miss the man so much. You know, I think that I am actually pretty well supported. Some of the things that I do in the business are things that are just decisions that I have to make, you know, and it's not usually something that has some type of spiritual crisis to it or not. It's just, you know, does it make sense to do that or not? You know, how much money can I spend on this or not? Those sorts of things. So yeah, I think I'm supported well, and I have no complaints on that.
And have You spoke just a little bit about this, but could you say anything more about any financial or material sacrifices you may have made to be faithful to this calling as the publisher of Inner Light Books?
Well, I came to realize fairly early on that I wouldn't be able to pay myself a salary, but I didn't need it. You know, I came into this seriously after I retired from my job when I was 62. So I had some money set aside in my 401k, and I have my Social Security money, and Lynn and I have no problems with maintaining our house and paying for all those sorts of expenses. So I haven't really sacrificed anything financially. I have underwritten the enterprise for a number of years. I think out of the last 10 years, 2 or maybe 3 years, I turned a little profit, which just meant I didn't spend more than I brought in. But you know, it has been something that I've done as a free gospel ministry. I do not get paid for the work I do. I do pay the people, the technical people that I use to help me because they need to get paid for it. And I do try to pay my authors. And as you know, there isn't much. As Paul Buckley once said, I turned him into a thousandaire. and so I would say that if I sold more books and I gave more money to the authors, I would like that. So, and it would probably mean I would break even or show a little profit every year. And that would be better than the other way around. But mainly, I just want to get the word out. You know, this isn't about, I'm not, it's, you know, they say that God doesn't give you something that you can't bear. And actually, I think there's more to it than that God gives assignments to people who are prepared, and prepared in different ways. And I was at a point in my life where the financial part of it wasn't a big deal. It was more just a time commitment and doing the spiritual work, you know, developing because I'm making judgment calls on what is right and what is wrong, and some of the things that my authors say, you know, and I have to be able to, is this coming from the right place? You know, is this going to be understood in the right way? Those sorts of things. And so that's always been more of a concern for me than anything to do with money.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of some issue you took to God in prayer or sought divine guidance for, but that you had to decide about in your publishing work?
Well, I don't have any specific things that I'd want to bring up, but I will say that I've published 21 books and I've probably rejected at least 20 manuscripts. And that's hard, you know, because I always realize whenever somebody submits a manuscript that they've put their heart and soul into it. And when I turn it down, it isn't just an economic decision, but it's mainly because what the person was saying didn't particularly resonate with me. And actually a couple of those books were later published by other people and did quite well. You know, I might have had a bigger seller if I would have published them, but it didn't resonate with me. So those are the things that I have to sit in prayer with. You know, why is it I'm not getting the message here? And it's a judgment call. You know, but that's probably the hardest thing. It's when I get something that could be deserving of being published and I don't feel like doing it. You know, to tell somebody no, sorry, go somewhere else. And I do now what I try to do is I try to recommend somebody else, you know, that might be interested in it if I think it would be publishable.
Mm-hmm. Have there been any touchstones in those years of publishing when you felt a sense of having been particularly faithful?
Well, I think when I first met David Johnson, he came to my house. He was looking for the Inner Light bookstore, Inner Light Books bookstore, and he saw, and he was in the neighborhood. He was having lunch with his son and daughter-in-law and his wife, and he thought he'd just drop in and pick up a couple of books. And I was painting the front of my house when he came over, and we ended up having a discussion. And I invited him to the Thursday night group at the San Francisco meeting, and he came. And he asked me a question. He said, "Can I ask you, what do you do to prepare yourself for worship?" And so we had a long discussion on that. And he said, "Well, I've been working on this book about that. Would you be interested in looking at my manuscript?" And I thought, well, I guess, and I did, and it was really lovely. And I don't like to go into too many details how the original text differs from what was put out, but there were some changes were made where my experience helped David. And that book, A Quaker Prayer Life, has been very well received. In fact, I just found out it's on the reading list for the Friendly Women's something group. And it's a lovely book. And through that, I made a connection to David that was a real spiritual connection. And I've done 2 other books with him, and there might even be a 3rd in the future. But that was a book that when he first gave it to me, I wasn't quite sure if it was really something I could do. But in prayer, I realized not only should I do it, but I had to do it because it was very important. And it answered questions that people often ask, and they're afraid to, or they'd like to ask, but they're afraid to ask. Quite friends can be sort of guarded about how they approach their spiritual life.
So David Johnson is a Quaker author from Australia. What was it like to work with an author and to publish several books of his, an Australian friend?
Well, one of the blessings, and I find it, I like to joke sometimes that I operate a multinational business. It's not a multinational corporation, but I have authors from the British Isles and from Australia, 3 authors from Australia, and then I'd have to count them up, 3 or so from England. And it's been interesting because it's part of the exposure I've had is to the worldwide Quaker movement. I know from friends from all over the world, primarily through my connection with Quip. And I would have to say that well, I don't know how to put this exactly. I'd have to say that much of the Quaker world is not as spiritually attuned as I would like it to be. I think that there's been a distancing from our Christian roots that is not healthy. And it turns out that people I know and that I've worked with in different parts of the world all agree with me. So we're part of that, I don't know what you'd call it, a cohort or a like-minded, fellow travelers, I think is the old term that they used in the lefty circles, fellow travelers in trying to reconnect friends to our Christian roots. Because as Lloyd Lee Wilson told me when he was a young man in the Cambridge meeting, a man named Elmer Brown, who unfortunately I never met, said to him, "Lloyd Lee, they might think that they can believe anything, but when they check what you really treasure about Quakers, its roots are Christian." Or those things are Christian. And I think that's true, and I think that it's something, and I know one of the problems is the toxicity of some forms of Christianity to people who are socially aware and seeking to right the wrongs in this world. And that toxicity is carried over to where they just don't trust anything that has that label Christian. And that's a crime. And it's more than that. It's part of the work of, dare I say, the adversary, to confuse people, to drive them away from that which can enable them to do those works, those good works that are required of us by God. And so working with friends from different sections of the Quaker world has been a real blessing to me and broadened my understanding, and I think have helped me deepen my faith.
Thank you. Are there any other ways that your experience of working with contemporary Quaker authors has changed you or affected your life, your views of Quakerism?
Well, one of the things that's happened is that everybody that all the authors that I've worked with have been extremely competent individuals, deep thinkers, people who've lived and walked the walk, just not only through what they write, but knowing them as individuals and having that fellowship with them has really deepened my understanding of the world and my spiritual life. And I think has contributed to me growing more than I might have if I hadn't had those opportunities or met those individuals.
You've served, you've traveled in the ministry with a few of these Quaker writers. What has that been like?
Well, accompaniment, which is a form of eldering, is what I've done with a number of the folks. And I've always found it very rewarding. It's not always easy. Sometimes, it can be quite a lot of work. And I'm not a presenter by inclination. So when I watch people who can go up in front of a crowd for 2 or 3 days, or even just for an afternoon, and do the work that they're doing in a competent way, and be able to deal with all the difficult personalities that you often run into in the Quaker world, it's been a real eye opener, and I'm really appreciative of it. And so what I do to enable people to do that work has been very gratifying to me. And I think it has been a way of my being faithful to this leading of proclaiming or the work of the written ministry, of helping those people, because it is a combination. People who are the good writers tend to be also really good presenters, and I don't know why that is. I guess it's just part of their personalities. They're at heart teachers, And as I said to a young friend the other day, who told me that they wanted to deepen their spiritual life, so they were for the first time in their life seriously starting to read the Bible, and that it was challenging at times. And I said, well, when you read the Gospels, remember that the followers of Jesus, when they addressed him, they always called him Rabbi, which means teacher. We're here to open up ourselves to be taught. And that's one reason why I think he also said, be ye like the little children. Little children want to learn. They're always curious. They're asking why, how come? And that's how we're supposed to be in our spiritual lives. We're just not here to accept dogma. We're here to question, to investigate, to learn, to grow. And these people that I've accompanied in that work have all been excellent at doing that. And there's such a need for it. And they're essentially, the office of the traveling minister was such an important part of the Quaker world for so many years. And in the last part of the 20th century, it seemed to fade away for various reasons. And I think it's something we need to revive, because what oftentimes happens is Quakers tend to be relatively small groups, often very isolated from other Quakers. And to have somebody with that knowledge and that passion and that ability to communicate come and be with them for a short period of time is wonderful. And the way the modern age is, instead of going to them, oftentimes now they come to another place, a retreat center, or a yearly meeting or quarterly meeting. All of those places are where that type of work can be done. And for people who really have a desire for it and an appetite for it, but aren't getting it in their home meetings for whatever reason, because not everybody's a skilled minister. Not everybody. Ministry can happen. Anybody can give ministry. God can choose anyone to deliver a message. And I've witnessed that. But just because somebody delivers a message once or twice or even several times doesn't mean necessarily that they're a minister. They might be at that moment, but that isn't their personality. That isn't what they were put in this world to do.
Thank you so much. Is there anything more you have to say about faithfulness, or about your experience of faithfulness in yourself or others?
Well, speaking to you about faithfulness, I don't, it's like talking to the Pope about Catholicism. It's I'd have to say that faithfulness to me is one of the most important attributes of the spiritual life. Oftentimes, we'll become discouraged, and it's easy to throw in the towel and say, "Oh, forget it. This is just too hard." But by being faithful and going back and trying again and knowing, well, I'm going to get clobbered over the head again, but being faithful and continuing and waiting is so important to the spiritual life and to spiritual growth. We live in a very, the modern world is so absorbed with the cult of personality, of people, of celebrity, of people wanting that in one form or another, and it diminishes the value of those people, those quiet people who come and just do the daily things that need to be done. And their faithfulness is a living example for us. So people who tend to the people out on the street are just, my heart goes out to them, how they can deal with that day in and day night, but it's their faithfulness. They don't give up. And it would be very easy to say, I don't want to deal with these people anymore, but they don't. They go out and they do it, and they're the models for me. And I do think that we can encourage one another to be faithful, but in doing that, we become vulnerable, and you have to be willing to be vulnerable.
Yes, that was beautifully said. Do you have a sense of how Quakers are called to be in community with each other in this unprecedented time of change and challenge?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I do think that the events of this past year really solidified for me the value of being in community with others. Our meeting, the San Francisco meeting, has done a very good job of keeping people connected via Zoom. And now I know that sort of says, yeah, that shows, your white privileged life, people who can afford all this and have people who understand it. But it's been true. It's been, it's kept us from succumbing to that loneliness that I think a lot of people are really having problems dealing with now. And I'm not saying that people in meeting aren't having problems dealing with it, but it does give them an avenue to work on it. And I think that I'm praying and hoping that this will be a lesson for all of us to really recommit ourselves to our community. And the first part of the community is a local meeting. And I do think, as they say, think globally, act locally, that all of us should really put a little more effort into our meetings and helping those in our meeting who need help, whether it's just an encouraging word or bringing them a cooked meal or whatever it takes. I am serving on right now 2 different support committees, and that work is very, very satisfying for me because the people I'm working with are all basically ministers, and I know that the work I do with them is probably much more influential than if I were out giving talks or something, because they're going to be giving talks and they're going to be making impressions and they're going to be making connections, and they need support, and that support is so important.
Thank you. So you've been talking about how in this time of pandemic, Quakers have used Zoom quite a lot to continue our connections and community. I'm also aware that you live in California, and so you've been much closer to the unprecedented wildfires that are going on, and in that sense close to the effects of climate change, which will just be increasing. Do you think Quakers have a message in this time of climate change?
Well, I really do. I think that in our we have a testimony for stewardship. In stewardship, oftentimes we're just thinking about the resources that we have. How do we make sure our meeting houses are maintained? Make sure that our But we have a stewardship for the earth, and the world is facing so many challenges right now. But I do think that the climate change one is the one that could, if we really don't get a hold of that challenge very quickly, it's going to reach a point of no return. And that's what frightens me. As you say, living in California and having lived here my whole life, in the 70 years, well, probably my awareness of the world's only really 65 years old or something, but it's changed so much in that time. You know, one funny thing, and I don't know how to explain it, my garden used to be infestated with snails, the escargot snails, like the French like to eat. They're not around at all anymore. I don't know. I don't understand it. I've mentioned it to a couple of gardeners, and they don't have an explanation either. But I think it's just gotten too hot and too dry. And the moisture that those little critters need is gone, and so they're not eating all my plants. But I still sort of miss them, even though I used to hate them and round them up all the time. But yeah, there are other things. The fires that burnt through the redwood forest so close to the Ben Lomond Quaker Center this last year. It's very sobering. Members of our meeting, or who had been members of our meeting, who are living down in the Santa Cruz Mountains, had to leave. None of them lost their homes, but it's so disruptive. And I do think that Quakers, I know in the Philadelphia area that I forget what the term is. What are the Quakers called? The Earth Witness Quakers. They did the work with the PNC Bank, and I think that was a really good example of how you could do a nonviolent educational witness and get people to change their ways. Now, it didn't end coal mining, but it at least was to have that effect of a first start, and we need more of that. I think I know my meeting's involved with supporting the Poor People's Campaign, and while that's not predominantly an environmental campaign, it has portions of it that are, because the climate change affects the marginalized people more than it does other people, or they get the worst of it anyway because of the pollution and water they can't drink and those sorts of things. So yes, Quakers do, and I think that is one of the roles that we really need to look at right now and in the future.
Yeah, so you were talking about the Earth Quaker Action Team in the Philadelphia area. And of course, there are many sort of intersecting crises and that Quakers are attempting in various ways to address and that need to be addressed in our society. As we come to the end of this interview, is there anything more that you would like to say about any message you have about Quakerism or about God or about your sense of how people are called to live in this time?
Well, I do think that it benefits everyone if they take a little time every day and sit in silence and seek God. I think that it's beneficial to every single human being, and we don't do it enough. And so encouraging people to try that, which I call prayer, but you might call meditation, you might just call zoning out or whatever, is an important thing. It's part of the discipline. I think that that friends have a discipline that, if we followed it, would vastly improve the world. And I think that part of the mission of contemporary friends is to examine the roots of our history and where we got things right, because we didn't always get things right, but where we got them right and why. And I think if they examine that, it's because there was this discipline of putting God at the center of our lives, to having everything we do be work that is, if not directly for God, which is in keeping with God's commandments. And it's not as hard as it seems. It's just that, like I said earlier, we're at a time and place where wealth and over egotism and falling prey of the cult of the personality of celebrity has really made us lesser human beings. That we're interchangeable, basically, which is one of the things. And we look at these differences and we try to split each other apart, and we're not. We're all the same at heart. And the basic thing of being a human being means that we're a child of God. We're made in God's image, and if we follow the lessons that we've been given, that God wants us to live in peace. God wants us to live in harmony. God, if you read the Bible, he's in the Old Testament, he's always talking about taking care of the widows and the orphans, being kind to the alien amongst you, making sure that those who are injured get redress, that there's restitution for wrongs. There's so much that's in there that we need to apply to our personal lives and to the world in general. And the religious society of friends is supposed to be our mission. We have the audacity of calling ourselves the friends of Christ. So if we're going to be the friends of Christ, which he says, do as I command you or do as I instruct you, then we should be doing what he's instructed us to do. And if we did that, the world would be a better place. And if enough of us did it, I think we might actually be able to conquer some of these great challenges that are facing us. Because we're not going to do it as individual entities running around espousing one ideology or another.
Thank you so much. I wish I'd thought to get a whole bunch of your books by many different authors to show at the end, but I only have my own books on the desk. And I just like to show them as just like some examples of books published by Inner Light Books. There's 2 that you've published. And it made such a difference in my life for you to publish these books. I just want to say, in case people are wondering, because we have the same last name, I didn't meet you till after I had sent you these manuscripts that were not related in any way that we know, at least by blood. And I'm just so grateful.
We're probably very distant cousins in one way or another.
Well, all human beings are.
Exactly. The one thing I did want to say, because you did show your books, anybody hearing this interview, if they're interested in the books that Inner Light Books has produced, the website's a good website, maybe a little old-fashioned, but all the books are listed there with excerpts from the book. So if you want to just read a passage or 2 to see if the book would be interested, you'd be interested. And you can order them directly from me. Now I know that it's not the cheapest way to do it. And my shipping costs are much higher than if you have free shipping from some retailers, but they're there. And almost all the books, not all the books, are in ebook format if people prefer reading off their devices, even though I'm a proponent of the print book because I think as a utilitarian medium, it can't be beat. You can go back and forth and mark it up and bend corners and do things. And I know you can probably do that digitally, but I prefer the paper. But yeah, it's been a blessing, Marcelle, and I have to say that in meeting you and working with you, it was a blessing and a joy, and I always enjoy talking to you. So maybe we can talk again soon.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure.